very warm welcome to this edition of Europe Calling. This is the big webinar series which puts together experts and decision makers on questions of European public policy with citizens. More than 70,000 people already joined our webinar series, and this time it's a common effort with Alexandra Geese, my dear colleague, who's working on digital market and digital services regulation in the European Union, and myself, Sven Giegold. I'm the spokesperson of the group of the German Greens in the European Parliament. But all this is not important today because we have so great guests. Professor Zuboff and Max Schrems. We also get some special guests later. So Jan-Philipp Albrecht, the founding rapporteur of the GDPR, will join us, and also the rapporteur for the Digital Markets Act in the European Parliament, Andreas Schwab, will join us later or is already here. However, so surveillance capitalism is such an important subject. It's of course a bit ironic to organize this webinar on Zoom. I received some funny remarks about this, but it's the only tool which works as a webinar with a simultaneous translation and can digest a stunning 2,500 registrations which we had for that seminar. And it shows how important the subject is. But what this here is about is to help us to make the right legislation. The deadlines for amendments to the EU Commission's proposal is very soon. So we want to hear from you how to get it right, what to learn from what has happened so far in regulating the large digital giants. And therefore, we want to have a maximum of your views and input. But then later, you are also asked to make your remarks and ask questions. And for this, use the Q&A function. Type in your questions, your remarks, shortly and briefly, sharply, and we will read them later. You can direct them to Shoshana, to Max, and by that way, you can then also make it a democratic space by liking those remarks with a thumb up function which you like most. And then we have the most relevant questions raised later. And the last point to make is, if you raise your voice or ask questions and you represent a company or a lobby, you are welcome, but please say so that everything is transparent. And lastly, so that more people even find to us, please tweet about what you hear here, what you learn here. If things are touching you, are new for you, please share them in the social networks so that we get out of the message, and also spread, for instance, the tweets or other social media remarks which help people to join our discussion here. And lastly, everything is recorded in 2 languages, English and German. Later it will be put on YouTube. So if you raise your voice, you will be later online too, whether you like it or not. And I wish, I'm not sure whether Marx will put us for this to the European Court of Justice. He may even win, but I hope this time he pardons us. And now I hand over to my dear colleague, Alexandra Geese.
Thank you very much, Sven. A very warm welcome from my side as well. Since this is a bilingual webinar, and we also we're speaking from Europe on European matters, but we also want to reach a broad German audience, I will speak in German. I'm saying this, announcing this, so all the English speakers can look for interpretation, which you find on your screen where the little earth is. So, jetzt mache ich auf Deutsch weiter. Nochmal einen wunderschönen guten Abend von meiner Seite. Mein Name ist Alexandra Geese, ich bin Europaabgeordnete, Kollegin von Sven Giegold und verantworte hier in Brüssel größere Teile der Digitalpolitik der Europafraktion. Und insbesondere bin ich sogenannte Schattenberichterstatterin, also zuständige Abgeordnete der Grünen Fraktion für den Digital Services Act, der gemeinsam mit dem Digital Markets Act eine neue Grundlage für die Regulierung digitaler Dienste allgemein und der großen Plattformen im Besonderen legt. Wenn sich das jetzt so ein bisschen abstrakt anhört, es geht darum, welche Regeln müssen Google, Facebook, Amazon und alle anderen in Europa einhalten. Und das ist auch der Grund, warum wir heute Abend dieses Webinar organisieren, denn am Donnerstag läuft die Frist ab, bis zu der wir unsere Änderungsanträge einbringen können. Das heißt, alle Ideen, alle Ansätze, alle wichtigen Punkte, die wir in diesem Gesetz sehen wollen, die müssen bis Donnerstag formuliert und ins System eingereicht sein. Und dann wird im Herbst darüber verhandelt. Und heute stehen wir in Europa aus diesem Grund an einem Scheideweg. Wir haben nämlich jetzt die Chance, die globale Debatte mit unserer europäischen Gesetzgebung im digitalen Bereich zu prägen. Und das haben wir in der Vergangenheit schon bewiesen, dass wir das können, nämlich mit der Datenschutzgrundverordnung, die weltweit als Goldstandard gilt, auch wenn sie in Europa nicht immer perfekt umgesetzt wird, aber das werden wir gleich von Max Schrems noch hören. Und dazu stehen momentan in Europa 3 Gesetzesvorhaben an, die darüber entscheiden werden, ob wir in Europa Teil des Universums Überwachungskapitalismus bleiben oder ob wir einen eigenständigen Weg gehen, bei dem Demokratie, Freiheit und eine vielfältige Wirtschaftslandschaft im Fokus stehen. Und das erste Gesetz habe ich bereits genannt, das für digitale Dienste und digitale Märkte. Da geht es zum Beispiel darum, können wir spionierende Werbung durch ein besseres Werbemodell ersetzen? Können wir Privatsphäre der Nutzerinnen schützen? Können wir Nutzerinnenrechte verankern, damit Accounts nicht grundlos gelöscht oder gesperrt werden können? Und begleitet wird es vom Digital Markets Act, der wieder für einen fairen Wettbewerb sorgen soll zwischen den Unternehmen, denn heute gilt, wer die Daten hat, gewinnt. Das zweite wichtige Gesetz wird künstliche Intelligenz regulieren, damit künstliche Intelligenz wirklich den Menschen dient und nicht die effektive Inanspruchnahme von Grundrechten behindert und Menschengruppen diskriminiert. Und das dritte ist das große Gesetz über Daten, der Data Act, ein Gesetz zur Schaffung von europäischen Datenräumen. Denn nur wenn wir unsere Daten in Europa, in unserem rechtlichen Rahmen speichern und auch in großen Mengen selbstbestimmt verarbeiten können, sind unsere Demokratie und Freiheit, aber auch unser europäischer Wirtschaftsstandort langfristig gesichert. Ihr seht, wir stehen an einem Scheideweg. Heute Abend ist ein historischer Moment. In diese Woche wird der Grundstein für viele Dinge gelegt, die über unsere Zukunft entscheiden. Und deswegen freue ich mich ganz besonders, unsere erste Referentin heute Abend zu begrüßen, die große Intellektuelle, die das Konzept des Überwachungskapitalismus überhaupt formuliert hat und uns überhaupt die theoretischen Instrumente mit an die Hand gegeben hat, um das analysieren zu können, was wir erleben in unserer Welt und oft auch noch nicht in Worte fassen können, weil es so neu ist. Professor Shoshana Zuboff hat uns diese Worte gegeben. Sie ist Ökonomin, sie ist Professorin, sie ist Autorin, sie ist Aktivistin, sie ist Autorin von 3 Büchern, die jeweils genau eine neue technologische Epoche, ich würde nicht sagen eingeläutet haben, aber sie sofort beschrieben haben. Und ihr kürzliches Meisterwerk, das Zeitalter des Überwachungskapitalismus, ist bereits in 25 Sprachen übersetzt und wird mit Marx Kapital verglichen, natürlich nicht inhaltlich, aber von der Bedeutung her. Sie ist Charles Edward Wilson Professor Emerita an der Harvard Business School und Faculty Associate at Harvard's Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights. Und sie ist heute Abend bei uns mit diesem großartigen Publikum. Ich bin sehr geehrt, ihr das Wort geben zu dürfen. Frau Professorin Zuboff, Sie haben das Wort.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and thank you so much, Sven, for convening this important discussion, for inviting me to it, for inviting my friend Max Schrems, one of my heroes, and thank you to the many of you who are watching with us this evening, this afternoon, this morning, wherever you may be. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. You know, I like stories, so I'm going to begin this talk with what I think of as an iconic story about 21st century knowledge and power. The story was actually broke by Channel 4 News in London. It's about the Trump 2016 campaign's effort to deter Black American citizens from voting on Election Day in 2016. The investigative team from Channel 4 examined more than 5,000 data files that were leaked from the campaign with details on over 200 million individual American voters, along with all the analyses, the models, everything that was used to profile personality traits, political attitudes, behavioral dispositions, interests, concerns, vulnerabilities, and more. All of this in order to target and manipulate voter behavior, especially in the key swing states. For those of you who aren't familiar with these details of my country, the key swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. All right, so the campaign's digital director was a gentleman named Brad Parscale. He gambled his modest budget all on Facebook. Facebook sent corporate staff members, embedded them with the campaign to help Parscale dominate what they called, and I'm going to do air quotes here, the tools. The tools in this case used to identify the citizens least likely to support Trump, least likely. This audience, as Facebook calls it, was labeled deterrence. And the tools, which stand for Facebook's advertising arsenal, number one, massive scale concentrations of personal information. Number two, artificial intelligence. Number three, all the targeting mechanisms. These were used for the purposes of targeting for deterrence. Of this audience, it turns out, 54% were people of color and 3.5 million Black voters were part of this audience. So in my country, voter suppression is illegal. And yet, a senior campaign official boasted to reporters at the time of the campaign, quote, "We have major voter suppression operations underway." Black citizens were bombarded with Facebook's standard range of algorithmic targeting mechanisms, subliminal cues, engineered social comparisons, psychological micro-targeting, recommendation tools, real-time rewards and punishments, gamification, and more. But now, these were specifically engineered to persuade Black citizens that the most effective expression of their political protest was to withdraw from the election process entirely. Massive scale knowledge about citizens produced massive scale behavioral change from citizens. Black voter turnout did decline by 7 percentage points, the largest decline on record for Black Americans. Black voter turnout in those swing states where targeting was heaviest was a full 1 point lower than in the non-battleground states. All right, so what happened here? This episode suggests that citizens of the world's longest lived democracy voluntarily relinquished their solemn democratic right, the right to vote, without anyone ever holding a gun to their heads or showing up in the dead of night to threaten them with the gulag or the camp. Instead, these citizens ceded the right to self-govern in response to nothing more than engineered digital communications, freighted with inflammatory messages and disinformation tailored to individual psychological and political profiles until enough people chose to stay home on election day. Friends, this is not the totalitarian nightmare of Big Brother who breaks bodies in order to bend souls to his single truth. No, the work here is accomplished by what I have called instrumentarian power, a 21st century power, friends, secretly wrung from knowledge. It works its will through the pervasive architectures of digital instrumentation to manipulate and modify thoughts, attitudes, and behavior without the threat of terror, violence, or murder. There's no blood here, no bodies, no fingerprints, no enemy, no combat. It's seamless. In January 2020, as the world braced for an election season that would again test the resilience of American democracy, One illustrious Facebook executive, Andrew Bosworth, posted a blunt memo where he credited his corporation, Facebook, with Donald Trump's surprise 2016 electoral victory. So, he says, was Facebook responsible for Donald Trump getting elected? The answer is yes, but not for the reasons anyone thinks, he says. According to Bosworth, quote, Trump ran the best single digital ad campaign I've ever seen from any advertiser, period. The Trump campaign just used the tools we had to show the right creative to each person. Pascal, remember, the Trump digital czar, he confirmed this conclusion with his inimitable style. Quote, wonder why people in politics act like this stuff is so mystical. It's the same shit we use in commercial. It just has fancier names. So, how did this happen? It turns out that the economic logic that drives this transformation of secret knowledge about people into secret power over people is precisely what I have called surveillance capitalism. I call it that because it maintains core elements of traditional capitalism: private property, market exchange, growth and profit. But these cannot be realized without the technologies and social relations of surveillance. Hidden methods of observation invade personal experience and then extract behavioral data. In an extraordinary development, these data are then immediately claimed as the corporation's private property, available now for manufacture and sales. So I want to make one thing abundantly clear. The theory of surveillance capitalism challenges this property claim. It redefines it as theft. What happens after this theft occurs? Well, data travel to computational factories where they are computed into behavioral predictions. Surveillance capitalists sell the promise of certainty, a promise which requires data extraction and computation at unprecedented and therefore unimaginable scale. Just to give you a little sense of this, another leaked document, this time from Facebook in 2018, describes its AI backbone, that's its factory, as ingesting trillions of data points daily in order to produce 6 million behavioral predictions each second. These predictions are sold to business customers. These predictions are the products sold to business customers in a new kind of market that trades exclusively in human futures. Just like we have other commodities futures markets, futures of oil or wheat or pork or copper. In this new surveillance economy, personal information is the stolen treasure and surveillance is the getaway car. The entire economic edifice is built on this illegitimate bed of sand. So let's talk about surveillance capitalism for a moment more. You know, it rooted and flourished during the last 2 decades with very little to impede it, except, of course, my friend Max Schrems. It has prevailed in part because its leaders persuaded the world that their operations were somehow the inevitable expression of digital technologies and the digital future. In fact, nothing about surveillance capitalism was or is inevitable. Like every economic logic, surveillance capitalism is human-made, part discovery, part accident, part trial and error, part revelation. And you know, anything that is made by humans can be unmade by humans. So I'm going to take a moment to describe to you just kind of a thumbnail of surveillance capitalism's origin story at a particular place and particular time, because I really want you to understand how much this creation of a 21st century nexus of knowledge and power derives from specific historical conditions and human choices. 2 decades ago, when the World Wide Web was a brand new promise, and only 25% of the world's information was digitally stored, a tiny internet startup in Silicon Valley called Google had a great technology project, a great search engine, but it had not yet figured out how to make money. Then came the dot-com bust. And with it, suddenly surveillance capitalism was pulled into discovery. Google's very swanky, high status investors threatened to pull out because they weren't seeing the monetization that they needed. The company's founders were terrified. They did not want to fail. That became their preeminent issue. And they were therefore determined to find a fast track to monetization. Interestingly, only a couple of years earlier, they had decried in a very well-read, well-circulated scholarly paper, they had decried advertising. And they had said that it would disfigure the internet and corrupt search engines. But now, in the heat of financial emergency, through trial and error, insight and chance, they discovered a way to crack the revenue problem, the secret massive scale extraction of human-generated data for downstream processes of manufacturing and sales that came to be known as online targeted advertising. Instead of selling search to large internet companies and other corporate clients, which was their business plan, Google's search engine would instead become a sophisticated surveillance operation. The large caches of data left over in Google servers when its users used search and entered into the various activities of choosing keywords and browsing, these leftover data had been called data exhaust, considered waste material. But now, unknown to users, these data were mined for predictive signals and computed into predictions of the likelihood that a particular person would click on a particular ad. And these predictions, as you know, came to be called the click-through rate. Now, these were the prediction products sold to advertisers whose fortunes changed dramatically because now their success would depend upon Google's gargantuan data flows and its exclusive capabilities in advanced computation, which even then they called our AI. In 2001, around the time of this breakthrough, Google founder Larry Page laid out his new vision in a small executive meeting they had convened to discuss what is Google's brand. And so Page ruminated out loud, and here's what he said. If we did have a category, it would be personal information. The places you've seen, communications, sensors, they're all really cheap. Storage is cheap, cameras are cheap. People will generate enormous amounts of data. Everything you've ever heard or seen or experienced will become searchable. Your whole life will be searchable. And that's how it happened, friends. We thought that we were searching Google, but now with this dramatic breakthrough, Google was to be searching us. The company's investors celebrated this, what they called ingenious 180-degree reinvention of the company. But Page and fellow executives worked hard to keep these operations secret for years, knowing that users would rebel against corporate mass surveillance and fearing that lawmakers might be stirred to action. According to the company's first brand manager, Page opposed anything that would reveal the scope of its aggressive data extraction and retention practices. Anything that might, quote, stir the privacy pot and endanger our ability to gather data. Page even questioned the legendary electronic scroll in the company's lobby that displays its continuous stream of search queries. He worried it would just tip people off to exactly how much information this company was collecting. There were good reasons, it turns out, for that secrecy, because Google discovered a gold mine. In 2004, when it went public, the first time we were able to discover that its revenues had increased in those 4 years by 3,590%. This public confirmation of Google's success represented what I call the surveillance dividend. It mesmerized every investor and entrepreneur, and they all embraced the Google breakthrough. So that's what happened. Surveillance capitalism thrived at Google. It migrated to Facebook. It became the default model of the tech sector. But it's important to understand that now surveillance capitalism migrates across what we think of as the normal economy, redefining nearly every sector: education, retail, finance, healthcare, insurance, every product called smart, every service called personalized. Indeed, virtually all software development now runs on the premise of maximum data extraction. By 2007, 97% of all digital information now was digitally stored, catapulting us decisively into an information civilization. And the question remained, what kind of civilization would it be? Surveillance capitalism has flourished in part because neither citizens nor lawmakers understood the consequences of an economic logic in which, first, profits depend upon making all human behavior more predictable across every domain of everyday life. We're not talking about the factory floor or the office. We're talking about every aspect of our daily lives. And second, we did not understand the consequences when personal experience was redefined as the free raw material that feeds these operations. This is where inevitability actually does apply, because it turns out that these economic imperatives inevitably produce anti-democratic effects, undermining self-determination at the grassroots and shaping a social structure surprisingly marked by unprecedented concentrations of knowledge and power. I say surprisingly, because wasn't this intended to be the golden age, the democratization of information in the digital century? Instead, on the strength of their surveillance capabilities, and astonishingly, in my mind, for the sake of the banality that is online targeted advertising, these empires engineered a fundamentally anti-democratic epistemic coup. Now, the word epistemic refers to everything concerned with knowledge and knowing. So what we're talking about here is a revolutionary takeover of what is known, how it is known, and who can know it. In an information civilization, principles of social order derive from the essential questions of knowledge, authority, and power that govern information. Who knows? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides who knows? These are three questions you can slip into your back pocket, and they will always provide you with a moral compass. Surveillance capitalists, it turns out, now in the year 2021, they hold the answers to each of these questions. though we never elected them to govern. This is the essence of the epistemic coup. The surveillance capitalist corporations know, they claim the authority to decide who knows. They do that by asserting ownership rights over humanity's personal information. And then they defend that authority with absolute power to control critical information systems and infrastructures. The epistemic coup proceeds in 4 stages. Each stage develops the conditions for the next. I'm not going to discuss these in detail. I just want to briefly define each one for a very specific reason. I want you to see the big picture. Too much of our discourse is fragmented. We talk about privacy or disinformation or manipulation as if these were distinct problem sets. They are not. They are stages in a unitary process, each one building on and integrating what went before. So very, very briefly, the first stage here is the unilateral and of course, therefore illegitimate appropriation of what I think of as elemental epistemic rights. Epistemic rights refers to my right to be the one who knows about my own personal experience and to decide if it is shared and with whom it is shared and for what purpose. And that epistemic right is the cause of which privacy is the effect. Because in deciding what is shared, I can also decide what remains private. The second stage, as you can see, builds on this. It's characterized by epistemic inequality. So what is that? It's defined by the difference between what I can know and what can be known about me, what I can do and what can be done to me. Then the third stage, epistemic chaos. This is what we've seen with the story of the Trump campaign. This is where knowledge becomes power. Unprecedented concentrations of knowledge are analyzed and modeled, producing powerful new targeting capabilities intended to influence, manipulate, and shape behavior. Algorithms are engineered to increase engagement in order to maximize extraction, which then continuously improves prediction. So here's that virtuous cycle that the surveillance capitalists have established. Unfortunately, it turns out that the human mind is drawn to the novel and the grotesque in the same way that our taste buds are drawn to sugar and fat. The result has been that this algorithmic amplification that is designed to maximize engagement in order to maximize extraction, it turns out that these algorithms are then driven to amplify the most corrupt, the most outrageous, the most extreme and inflammatory content. Now, much of it produced by coordinated schemes of disinformation. So epistemic chaos is the result. And we know it, we see it, we feel it, we live it. It's expressed in the splintering of our shared reality, the poisoning of social discourse, the paralysis of democratic politics, and sometimes even the instigation of violence and death. These conditions are fundamentally contrary to the social vision implicit in the right to freedom of speech, because that vision assumes that the best ideas naturally rise to the top in the free and fair discourse of the public square. But democracy has no defense against high velocity global communications in a private square where machine systems are engineered to unnaturally select corporate corrupt information, dangerous ideas in order to fulfill someone else's commercial objectives. No democracy can survive these assaults indefinitely. The fourth stage is epistemic dominance. And this is where the surveillance empires now are increasingly vying with democracy over the rights and laws and principles that define the social order. Epistemic chaos prepares the ground by weakening democratic institutions In this stage, the surveillance capitalists defend their authority over human-generated data with their absolute control over critical information systems and infrastructures that pertain to information production, collection, organization, analysis, manufacture, and communication. And upon which we all now, individuals, institutions, society, and governments, we all depend upon it. So just a couple of examples of epistemic dominance, because I want you to see how much this is growing and presenting itself in every direction now. The EU experienced a consequential expression of epistemic dominance when back in April of 2020, Apple and Google refused to modify their exposure notification protocol and their operating systems to accommodate European public health authorities' applications designed to be epidemiologically useful for notification and tracing. Instead, these folks displaced the authority of democratically elected officials and democratic governance. What I regard as really a terrifying display of their willingness to assert their absolute control of these critical communications infrastructures. There are many other examples. Look, we've got Facebook's audacious effort to foil democratic governance by funding and standing up its own so-called oversight board, absent any source of social legitimacy. And we've seen epistemic dominance now again in Australia, when Google and Facebook demonstrated their willingness to face down the Australian public and government over proposed legislation for an industry code that would require companies to pay publishers for news content. Google threatened to shut down search. Facebook actually did shut down many of its pages rather than submit. And in the end, there was legislation, but the companies made their backroom deals and they were largely exempted from the new industry code. So it was a loss, ultimately, for democracy and for the Australian people. So my friends, when it comes to the ultimate targets of this coup, let the word go out to the elected officials of our democracies, to the secretaries, the ministers, and the civil servants of every liberal democracy. In the words of the immortal John Donne, therefore do not send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. It tolls for us. It tolls for democracy. We're at a point, and I cannot stress this enough, where our issues are not with digital technologies or search or social media or any of that. Our issues are with the institution of surveillance capitalism. Surveillance capitalism is a political economic institution. It imposes a hidden institutional layer that sweeps up commercial and social action across all domains. It mediates nearly all consumption now, but also social participation, social relations, communication, knowledge production, and ultimately we see it endeavoring to insert the spaces between individuals and society and between individuals and democracy. So capitalism in our digital century, it could have taken many forms. Why are the surveillance economics winning this race so far? Well, there are many answers, but really the biggest answer is because democracy has not yet adequately intervened to stop it. The world's liberal democracies have thus far failed to construct a coherent political vision of a digital century that advances democracy. In contrast, of course, we have the Chinese who have learned how to design and deploy digital technologies that advance their system of authoritarian rule, strategies that are central to their domestic and their foreign policies. It's the West's failure here, my friends, that left the void. And that void was quickly filled by surveillance capitalism. We cannot allow this to be our legacy. Ours is a young information civilization that has not yet found its footing in democracy. Our time is comparable to the early era of industrial civilization, when factory owners had all the power. Their property rights were privileged above all else. The rights of workers and consumers were not even codified in law. Eventually, with decades of struggle, we did produce the rights and the laws to protect them, and the institutions charged with their governance and enforcement. Ultimately, and however imperfectly, binding industrialization, the industrial economy, to the principles of democracy. So my message here is not a pronouncement of doom, but a call to action. This third decade is our opportunity to lay the foundations for a democratic digital century. That's why this discussion matters, why this discussion is of historic importance. The foundations for the democratic counter-revolution are already being laid in the EU, as Alexandra began to discuss in her introduction. In Europe, you are on the frontier, and the world looks to Europe for leadership. I'm proud to say that in my country, in the United States, we are also seeing now significant developments that really are leaping ahead of where we were even a couple of years ago. And of course, there's also important work that's being done in the UK. All of these efforts contribute to the sense that we are finally at a turning point. Ultimately, of course, the liberal democracies must come together. We have to build on these developments. That means more than just a shared regulatory framework. It also means a shared vision of and commitment to the positive and creative action of institution building that will shape this civilization. So, as a bridge to our discussions for the rest of our time together, I want to conclude with just a few observations on the legislative challenges and opportunities that Europe is facing right now. As Alexandra mentioned, we have the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and importantly, the GDPR. And I'm looking forward to also discussing these questions in more detail in our session of Q&A and discussion. So, you know, I just want to underscore one more time. A century ago, the battles that we fought over industrialization were all focused on the economic domain. You know, the harms were most tangible on the factory floor. It was wages and working hours and working conditions, the safety of products. Today, of course, the harms are everywhere, in every setting of daily life. No one is exempt, nothing is exempt. These facts make the democratic response both more urgent and most deeply legitimate. Only democracy offers the countervailing power to tame surveillance capitalism. The picture in my mind is of the Titanic, you know, heading for the iceberg in the dark, that enormous ship. And the very first thing that has to happen, before we figure out, you know, why the Titanic went off course and what happened, the very first thing that has to happen is a quick change of trajectory. We need to shift the direction of this big boat. So the very first principle that I want to underscore here is that the digital must live in democracy's house, not as an arsonist, as a family member, subject to and thriving on its laws and values, we will need new institutional configurations and mandates. But key to all of this is that as we approach these new legislative frameworks, they must be muscular. They must be deeply resourced. They must be invested with significant enforcement powers. Without these capacities, democracy cannot enact the countervailing power that is absolutely necessary. Without these capacities, we will be playing around at the margins, unable to affect the progress of the epistemic clue and its coup, did I say clue? Unable to affect the progress of the epistemic coup and its clear and present dangers. The audit and enforcement powers, for example, of the Digital Services Act are game-changing in this regard, but they must be invested with the full force of democratic powers. And because the harms that we've been discussing fall upon citizens, I believe that it is essential to provide citizens with avenues of redress and combat. As in the case of the GDPR, new legislative initiatives such as the DSA require a right of private action. We will need more plaintiffs and trailblazers like our Max Schrems and his team. Max has helped to take the GDPR from word to deed. And in this next crucial phase, we will need to open the space for that kind of citizen action across an even broader field of harms. Citizen action is what drives the life of the law, and in my view, will be essential. Second, we need to be strategic. We need legislative initiatives with distinct and complementary objectives. And we also need to understand that tomorrow we will be building on today's initiatives. So we need to conceive of a unitary strategic path. On this dimension, the EU has a formidable start. Again, the big leap forward is not the GDPR or the DSA or the DMA. The big leap forward is the combination of these three historic and powerful legislative frameworks, especially if they are resourced and oriented toward comprehensive, continuous, proactive oversight and muscular enforcement. The Digital Services Act and its audit powers break the spell that has ruled for 2 decades. The potential here is to draw back the curtain, collect data, analyze algorithms, and when necessary, interrupt and even outlaw systemically dangerous operations. The Digital Markets Act is the opportunity to bring these audit and investigatory and enforcement powers now to the structural issues of monopoly and to the unaccountable power over critical infrastructure that defines epistemic dominance. The Digital Markets Act, if it has these muscular powers, has the opportunity to open the competitive landscape to alternative economic models and to challenge epistemic dominance with the same kind of regulatory commitment that are brought to critical infrastructure in other sectors, transportation, communication, energy, and other essential services. Also, it's important to mention the Digital Markets Act ex-ante regulatory approach finally begins to even the playing field as regulators can anticipate and intervene before new harms make their way through society. This kind of flexible and principle-based regulatory action is essential. Now, I don't want to suggest that these historic initiatives are the end, but rather that they found a critical new beginning. So what are just some of the outstanding issues that are going to need to be taken into consideration for interruption and outlaw as we move forward? Well, first of all, we are going to need to bring our intelligence and creativity to bear on the subject of information integrity. In the short run, we need to be able to institute the kinds of protocols that that suppress this machine process in which the most corrupt and inflammatory content is vaulted to the center of the private square that is social media under surveillance capitalism. And we need to figure out protocols that can be employed in the short term that are committed to giving prominence to the information that has integrity, the information that keeps us safe and that represents what is the true social vision of freedom of speech. In other words, the best ideas rising to the center of the public square. Secondly, we are going to have to, again, in the short term, there are steps we can take, and both of these issues I'm bringing up have kind of immediate short-term opportunities, but also we have to understand that they are medium-term and long-term challenges that we will be solving in the years to come. But the second one that I want to talk about is extraction itself, the illegitimate extraction of human-generated data. I've argued that extraction is a form of theft. And the real truth here is that these concentrations of human-generated data are the fundamental resource that enable the epistemic coup and all that follows from it. So we have to confront extraction. In many respects, you know, we've been focusing on things like content moderation. We've been focusing on illegal content, but these really are secondary. These really are sideshows compared to the core issue of illegitimate extraction. And of course, we have to realize that to a certain extent, this extraction has not been illegal, not because it shouldn't be, but simply because we don't yet have the laws to make it so. These laws will follow the need to codify those epistemic rights that we've discussed. We need now to codify in law what we once took for granted as an elemental or natural right. We need to codify in law the fact that I am the one who has the right to know my personal experience and decide if and how it is shared. And the truth is that these elemental rights have never come under systemic threat before, any more than we have laws, you know, to protect our rights to stand up or sit down or yawn. But now the surveillance capitalists have declared their right to know our lives. And under these unprecedented conditions, the once taken for granted right to know and to decide who knows about me must be codified in law if it is to exist at all. And finally, you know, when we talk about extraction, we're talking about the supply side of the epistemic coup. I also want to briefly mention the demand side. These are the human futures markets that produce the financial incentives that drive massive scale extraction. And so, of course, we have an opportunity now. We understand that these human futures markets that began with online targeted advertising inevitably produce anti-democratic consequences at the level of grassroots and its superstructure. And we have the opportunity to finally say these kinds of markets produce systemic threats and they should be outlawed. I'm not only referring here to the advertising markets that we now call surveillance advertising, But I'm also referring to countless other forms of these new prediction markets, whether they're in the insurance industry, the education industry, the real estate industry. These are now threaded throughout our economy. So there are many aspects, many instances of these markets that will want to take aim at. And the fact is that outlawing markets that trade in human futures is not beyond our grasp. We have outlawed markets that trade in human organs, that trade in human beings, because they are inevitably dangerous, a threat to people and democracy. And we can do the same here. So, to conclude, it turns out that we may have democracy, or we may have surveillance society, but we cannot have both. A democratic surveillance society is an existential and political impossibility. For the sake of a democratic digital century, the regulatory baton must pass from economists to the warriors for democracy. Lawmakers and citizens will be the protagonists of this decade as they rise to the protection and advancement of humanity's best idea. We have a democratic information civilization to build, my friends, and there really is no time to waste. Thank you.
Wow. Shoshana, that was strong. And what a pleasure in this world dominated by clicks to listen to 45 minutes powerful speech and intelligent design of logical arguments full of morality and, as you promised, stories. You triggered a lot of discussion, and I would like to share first two questions with you, and one is in German, so get yourself prepared for this funny language. I would also like to say one thing. It was also typical transatlantic speech, because what is progressive transatlantic speech? It means Europeans looking to America for hope and support, and Americans looking to Europe for hope and support. In the end, we can only do it together. We will not be rescued by each other. And that is, I think, in particular true when it comes to that subject. So I would like to share the thoughts of Peter König with you. König means, by the way, king in German. So müssen wir die digitalen Monopolrechte der digitalen Plattformen, Urheberrechte, Patentrechte, Geheimhaltungsrechte des Quellcodes und der Schnittstellen nicht reformieren, verkürzen und beschränken, um die Macht des Wissens wieder an die souveränen Bürger zurückzugeben und dem Wettbewerb auch in der IT wieder zum bestimmenden Marktprinzip zu machen. So you could also study the beauty of German of building long words and even longer sentences. Shoshana, I hope you could understand it, or shall I repeat it in English?
Yes, if you could, Sven, if you could just repeat the gist of the question.
Okay, I'll read it very quickly in English. It's easier then. Do we have to reform or shorten or limit digital monopoly rights of digital platforms, such as the rights of the or patent rights, secrecy rights of the source codes, and also the connections, in order to give back the power of knowledge to the sovereign citizens, and make competition again to the dominating market principle also in IT? Was this bad translation better to understand?
Well, let me answer this way. Monopoly power is one part of the problem, but it's not the entire problem. Historically, you know, the great example was in the United States in the late 19th century, the birth of antitrust law, and then finally around 1917 when our Supreme Court finally decided on the legality of breaking up what had been the largest and most pernicious monopoly, Standard Oil. So Standard Oil was broken up, but it was broken up into 36 companies. And those companies were each fossil fuel companies in their own right. And very quickly, those companies began to re-aggregate. And pretty soon we had ExxonMobil emerging from this antitrust breakup. So what is the point? The point is, if we take, for example, a Facebook or a Google, and we simply break it up, we simply turn it into smaller units, but those smaller units are continuing to operate according to the economic imperatives of surveillance capitalism, then we have not achieved our goal. So we have to pay attention to both of these. In breaking up companies and limiting monopoly power, we can do something very important, and that is we open up the competitive landscape. Because of course, I've talked about democracy having the countervailing power here, but we also have to recognize that we are going to get important help in this transformation process from the market itself. Surveillance capitalism in a very real way is a profound rupture of an ancient economic law called supply and demand. People do not want surveillance capitalism, and yet it's the only thing that there is on supply. So this kind of breaks down that whole principle. And there are, hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs, of companies that want to come on stream and attract investment, but they don't want to be doing surveillance capitalism. And so by breaking down monopoly power, we give this creativity of the market a chance to blossom again, and a chance to reconnect supply and demand, answer individuals' real needs and answer society's real needs. So I want to stress the Digital Markets Act with its structural orientation and the Digital Services Act with its orientation more to the internal operations, and how we audit and oversee and hold these internal operations to standards of fundamental rights and to standards of public service and public law, then these two things in combination with, of course, a GDPR as part of this landscape, as part of this canvas, this is where I think the strength derives from.
Thank you. And I have one more question before we then go to the next step. So, and this is by Tendai Tagarira. Sorry for my bad pronunciation. And this one is in English. In the race to artificial intelligence domination, data sets play a fundamental role, as artificial intelligence is only as good as the data set. How will Europe remain competitive against China if data harvesting, data processing, and data manipulation is hindered by legislation? Will Europe not risk becoming a second-rate player in the race to artificial intelligence? And then she follows with some praise for your book, and I can only join into this. So this is the German edition. I hope you have a copy, Shoshana.
I do,
anyway,
of course.
you can get it. You can get it yourself very easily. But now the serious question.
All right. Well, look, what we're dealing with now, I mean, when we talk about epistemic chaos, we're dealing with the wholesale corruption of information flows. And so part of the challenge now, if we want to have a society that can function as with common sense, a society that can function with the kind of democratic discourse that is necessary, especially when we disagree, we are not being served now for these fundamental societal requirements. We are not being served now because the worst information, the most corrupt information, the most toxic information is being thrust forward when the common sense information, the information with integrity, is being shunted to the sidelines. In a normal functioning society, it's just the opposite. There's always some crazy stuff, but it emerges at the fringes and it stays at the fringes. And the trust in the democratic system is, the trust in the freedom of speech, the right to that freedom, the trust is, the faith is, that in an open, free and fair public square, it's the good ideas that are thrust into the center. It's the good ideas that most of us get to participate in and learn about and communicate about. So the exact opposite is happening to us now. This is weakening our institutions. It's weakening our society, and it's driving us apart. So I see no value in trying to keep this system intact, because actually it's the source of danger. The person who asked this question also kind of brought up a kind of national security dimension that I think is worth mentioning. You know, there was a time with the war on terror, the tragic events of 9/11, where the whole governmental shift occurred in the United States. Before 9/11, if you were on Capitol Hill talking about the internet, most likely you were talking about privacy legislation. After 9/11, most likely you were talking about total information awareness. And what happened was these fledgling internet companies, with their new surveillance capabilities, probably would have come under the suppression from federal privacy legislation, had it not been for how 9/11 changed the priorities, changed the emphasis, changed the sense of need within the government. But what I want to call to this discussant's attention is that, you know, right now there are some very different views that are being developed in the national security domain, because now the fact that our lives have been made so transparent, the wholesale destruction of privacy that has taken place primarily as a result of surveillance capitalism. What this has done is what in the information warfare discourse, this has increased our attack surface. It's increased our attack surface as individuals, and it's increased our attack surface as societies. And this now has become a grave concern among many in the national security field. When I told you the story of the Trump campaign, that is a perfect explanation, a perfect illustration of how this paroxysm of human-generated data, now made available through Facebook, on Facebook, anybody with the right advertising budget, the right know-how, any oligarch, anyone who's determined to do so can get access to these huge concentrations of information, as we saw in my story about particular groups, particular people, particular audiences, and they can wreak havoc. So we are now more vulnerable than we have ever been, more vulnerable to foreign manipulation, to oligarchic manipulation, to political manipulation, to the manipulation simply that comes through these commercial channels of advertisers and other commercial customers. So I don't think that, that we're at risk of weakening ourselves with respect to China. On the contrary, I do think that if the Cold War has taught us anything, it is that a strong democracy is a magnet for just about everyone in the world. And the strong democracy, strong democratic institutions, good information with integrity that we can learn by, that we can come together with, that we can do science with. These are the things that will make us strong. And these are the things that will allow us to compete against, for example, China or any other competitor.
Thank you. And I also, and that is a long-held view, in particular of the German Greens, that we will succeed in global competition on the basis of our values and by credibility in our values, and not by selling them on a global marketplace. Well, thank you. So now let's listen to another hero, first hero today, now second hero, Max Schrems. Max, we were placing great hopes, and we just heard it again from America in the GDPR. So, you were already in the courts before the GDPR, and you continue to use law enforcement. You even have set up your own organization with a beautiful logo, and now we would like to hear on the view out of surveillance capitalism. Where are we in Europe in the legal framework? And what is the reason that GDPR has not helped us out of surveillance capitalism? What is your balance sheet? And what's your recommendations for the next steps? Max, the floor is yours. And you are, of course, not only a hero, but a lawyer. And that is both to be combined. It's very rare, but it exists. Max, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot. I was asked to speak in German, as apparently around 90% of the listeners are German speaking. So I'm just quickly going to switch. As you all know by now, there's this interpretation button on the bottom of Zoom if you need to switch to German. Ja, danke auf jeden Fall. Ich wollte mal jetzt überlegen, was ich noch hinzuzufügen habe, weil Shoshana hat, glaube ich, schon einen wirklich sehr breiten Bogen gespannt und extrem viele relevante Punkte durchgehend angesprochen. Und ich glaube, es ist interessant, sich vielleicht zu überlegen, wie man das konkret auf den Boden bringt, auf sozusagen einer anderen Ebene von jetzt ganz theoretisch. Dann haben wir normalerweise die gesetzlichen Regelungen, über die wir noch nachher reden können. Und wir machen dann praktisch die Durchsetzung von diesen Gesetzen, also wie dann am Ende irgendeine Theorie am Handy auch ankommt. Und das ist eigentlich unsere Kernaufgabe. Und ich glaube, da kann man gut drüber reden, wie zum Beispiel auch gewisse Dinge nach der DSGVO nicht funktionieren. Ich glaube, vorab ist auch wichtig zu sagen, dass wir wirklich jetzt sehr am Anfang von diesen ganzen Debatten sind. Das ist auch, glaube ich, zuerst schon sehr klar geworden, dass wir sehr am Anfang der digitalen Transformation sind. Wenn wir uns überlegen, was weiß ich, Arbeitnehmerrechte sind seit 100 Jahren ein heißes Thema und da hat es sehr lange gebraucht, bis sich das durchgesetzt hat, und so ähnlich wird es auch bei der Digitalisierung wahrscheinlich sein. Ganz am Anfang, was, glaube ich, interessant finde, ist der Punkt, dass es oft dargestellt wird als unausweichlich, also dass die aktuelle Situation, wie die Digitalisierung funktioniert, irgendwie Gott gegeben ist und deswegen so sein muss. Und dieser Narrativ ist, glaube ich, extrem spannend, weil der sehr festgefahren ist und auch von der Industrie sehr stark sozusagen wiederholt wird. Ich sehe das zum Beispiel selber bei jedem Interview, was wir haben, heißt ja so, naja, wenn der Datenschutz doch wirklich kommt, dann funktioniert das Internet doch morgen nicht mehr. Bei jeder EuGH-Entscheidung heißt, wenn der EuGH so entscheidet, dann ist morgen das Internet kaputt. Und ich glaube, dieses Narrativ, dass die aktuelle Situation unausweichlich ist, ist durchaus dominant und das ist relativ interessant. Und bei uns kommt es auch oft dann heraus, wenn wir vor Gerichten sind, vor Behörden etc., dass selbst teilweise Datenschutzbehörden sich gar nicht vorstellen können, dass man sowas datenschutzkonform machen könnte. Und das führt natürlich dazu, dass wir teilweise sehr schöne Dinge im Gesetz haben, aber nicht unbedingt, die auch dann umgesetzt werden oder auch wirklich in der Praxis auf den Computern dann landen. Ganz noch sozusagen vom Juristischen, ganz vom Anfang, was ich interessant gefunden habe, ist die Überlegung, wer hat eigentlich das Recht an diesen Daten? Es gibt ja so Theorien zum Eigentumsrecht und eine klassische ist sozusagen, dass man sich Eigentum durch Arbeit aneignet. Also wenn man sozusagen eine Sache findet und sich bearbeitet etc., kann man dadurch Eigentum gewinnen. Das ist so eine klassische Theorie. Und das funktioniert aber nur, wenn was eigentumslos ist, also wenn es vorher niemandem gehört. Und bei personenbezogenen Daten ist ja bisher sozusagen schon die Vorstellung, dass die mal dem Nutzer gehören. Und sobald man dann sich was aneignet, dann ist es natürlich Diebstahl. Und ich glaube, da ist jetzt sozusagen, wenn man es klassisch eigentumstheoretisch angeht, circa die Debatte, die wir da oft haben. Und da haben wir, ich glaube, wenn man jetzt gerade diese Überwachungskapitalismus-Idee sich anschaut, in Europa prinzipiell ein bisschen anderen Zugang bisher zum Glück. Nämlich, dass eben das Recht auf Datenschutz ein Grundrecht ist, also ein unveräußerliches Recht im Prinzip, ein Recht, was ich ähnlich wie mein Wahlrecht, mein Recht an der körperlichen Unversehrtheit, an meiner Meinungsäußerung etc. habe und das praktisch mal vom dogmatischen Ansatz ein nicht kapitalistisches Recht ist, ein nicht sozusagen finanzielles Recht ist. Und da haben wir sozusagen schon mal einen Ansatz in Europa, der, glaube ich, schon dogmatisch und grundsätzlich anders ist als in den USA in vielen Bereichen. Das ist auch ähnlich zum Beispiel im Urheberrecht. Da gibt es durchaus sozusagen nicht kommerzielle Urheberrechte in Europa, die in den USA bestehen, aber nicht so dominant sind, also einfach politisch weniger relevant sind wahrscheinlich. Und ich glaube, da haben wir eben als Europa doch eine Möglichkeit, in einem Mindset zu sein, der einer nicht überwachungskapitalistischen Gesellschaft vielleicht schon näher ist oder vielleicht weniger Barrieren überkommen muss, um dorthin zu kommen. Und ich glaube, es ist eben interessant zu fragen, welche Teile müssen wir entkommerzialisieren? Also wir haben Dinge wie zum Beispiel Teile meines Körpers kann ich nicht verhökern. Aber auch das ist nicht ultimativ. Ich kann meine Haare zum Beispiel verhökern, ich kann halt nicht meine Leber verhökern. Ne? Also da ist immer interessant, wie weit gehen wir bei solchen Grundrechten. Ich kann mein Wahlrecht nicht verhökern, aber ich kann zum Beispiel mein Recht auf Meinungsfreiheit verkaufen, indem ich ein Non-Disclosure Agreement unterschreibe. Also auch bei solchen Grundrechten stellt sich immer die Frage, wie weit wir gehen. Ich glaube, dass wir von der Dogmatik her nur in Europa generell einen weniger kommerziellen Ansatz normalerweise bei den Dingen haben. Deswegen ist da der Zugang wahrscheinlich oft sinnvoller. Das große Problem, was ich in der Praxis sehe, ist, dass dieser prinzipielle dogmatische Ansatz in der Industrie absolut nicht angekommen ist. Also wir haben einen großen Teil der Industrie, die praktisch, glaube ich, sehr weit weg von der Gesellschaft und der Politik sind. Wir sehen das in der DSGVO sehr gut. Da hat der europäische Gesetzgeber eigentlich recht gut vorgelegt und hat gesagt, wie das funktionieren soll. Und wir sehen jetzt 5 Jahre, nachdem die DSGVO verabschiedet worden ist, weitestgehend Ignoranz. Also weitestgehend einfach auch, wenn man mit Anwälten spricht, die zum Beispiel Unternehmen vertreten. Ich glaube, dass die schlichtweg nicht überzeugt sind davon, dass diese Gesetze irgendeine Legitimität haben, dass die irgendwie zulässig sind, dass die überhaupt existieren sollen. Und da ist es für uns oft sehr schwierig, irgendjemanden überhaupt zu überzeugen, dass das ein Gesetzesbruch ist, dass das nicht geht, dass das ein Grundrechtsbruch ist. Und da ist es interessant, weil ich glaube, wir in Europa so eine Art Bubble haben, die oft aus der Industrie herauskommt und sehr viel aus Anwälten, Beratern etc. geht, die mit massivem Kapital, mit massivem Geld dazu unterstützt wird, diesen oft politischen Konsens zu unterminieren. Und wir sehen das in den Gerichten, wir sehen das in der PR, wir sehen das bei jedem Journalisten, der fragt, naja, wenn du halt was gratis haben willst, dann musst du halt deine Daten hergeben, ist das nicht sowieso fair. Und ich glaube, da sieht man, dass dieses Recht an Daten, was wir europäisch eigentlich gut geregelt hätten, in der Realität oft nicht so ankommt und einfach bei den Entscheidungsträgern zum gewissen Grad ignoriert wird. Wir haben jetzt zum Beispiel gerade ein großes Projekt zu Cookie-Bannern. Ich glaube, jeder Mensch hasst Cookie-Banner, der die jemals gesehen hat. Es gibt da Statistiken der Industrie, dass nur 3% der Leute wirklich zustimmen wollen. So ein Cookie-Banner ist ja eine Aufgabe meines Grundrechts. Also im Prinzip gebe ich da mein Grundrecht auf. Wie ich jedes Grundrecht aufgeben kann. Ich kann auch mein Grundrecht auf Leben verwirken, indem ich von der Brücke springe. Das ist in einer liberalen Gesellschaft so. Aber in dem Fall ist interessant, dass ca. 3% da ihr Grundrecht tatsächlich aufgeben wollen und praktisch ihr gesamtes Online-Tracking zur Verfügung stellen wollen. Aber dadurch, dass man diese Cookie-Banners eben so designt, wie wir sie alle kennen, kriegen sie über 90% Grundrechtsaufgabe. Und das ist schon interessant, weil das ist sozusagen, wie wenn ich sage, okay, wir haben durchschnittlich, was weiß ich, 1/3 der Leute, die nicht wählen wollen oder 1/4, aber ich bekomme durch Tricks 90% dazu, dass sie nicht wählen, so ähnlich wie wir jetzt das Beispiel von Voter Deterrence gehört haben, dann haben wir ein massives grundrechtliches Problem. Und ich glaube, dass das im Datenschutz sehr außergewöhnlich ist. Also wir haben wenig andere Bereiche, wo so massiver Rechtsbruch begangen wird von großen Konzernen, die damit viel Geld machen und das auch vollkommen öffentlich machen und sich teilweise dann noch als innovativ branden, wie wir es im Datenschutz haben. Das ist auch mit ein Grund, warum ich mich, glaube ich, mit dem Datenschutz weiter beschäftigt habe. Und was wir jetzt sehen nach 3 Jahren DSGVO, ist, dass wir zunehmend zum Beispiel konfrontiert werden mit der Aussage, naja, wenn ihr da die DSGVO durchsetzen wollt, das ist aber schon eine extreme Position. Also so ein Grundrecht dann wirklich auch in der Praxis durchzusetzen, das ist schon extremistisch. Und da sieht man, dass der Narrativ teilweise in der Industrie nicht wirklich angekommen ist und dieser Change von einem Mindset. Und das ist besonders interessant, weil oft da auch so diese Grundrechtsverletzungen klein geredet werden. Also wir haben zum Beispiel, die Beispiele sind jetzt gekommen von Werbung, getargeteter, wo praktisch Jahre meines Online-Klickverhaltens und jede Seite, die ich besucht habe, mitgeschrieben wird praktisch von Google zum Beispiel und das auch von Facebook etc. mitgespeichert wird, was eine extreme Überwachung ist. Also wir haben in Europa die Diskussion gehabt von der Vorratsdatenspeicherung, wo es nur um die Metadaten gegangen ist. In dem Fall geht es um wirklich jede Seite, die ich anschaue. Und nicht um Terrorismusprävention zu machen, wie zum Beispiel bei der Vorratsdatenspeicherung, sondern um die Klickrate um ein paar Prozent zu verbessern von irgendeiner Werbung. Also da wird wirklich mit Kanonen auf Spatzen geschossen und die Industrie findet das vollkommen normal und ist auch der Meinung, dass das ein vollkommen legitimer Zugang ist. Wir haben es so ähnlich bei Kreditauskunft ein. Also in Deutschland ist ja die Schufa zum Beispiel ein großes Thema. Ich verstehe bis heute nicht, wie ein Privatunternehmen sagen kann, ich habe das gottgegebene Recht von 80 Millionen Leuten, Finanzdaten zu speichern, auch Leute, die noch nie irgendwas nicht bezahlt haben, nur weil jemand in der Zukunft vielleicht mal was nicht zahlen könnte. Und wenn wir uns das vergleichen mit der EuGH-Rechtsprechung zum Beispiel zur Vorratsdatenspeicherung, wo man sagt, na, nicht mal für Terrorismusprävention ist zum Beispiel die Metadaten erlaubt, dann ist es schon interessant, wie gerade die Industrie da wirklich sehr weit weg ist und sehr weit die Dinge eigentlich ignoriert. Und das ist teilweise, muss ich ehrlich sagen, in unserer Arbeit durchaus frustrierend, weil man wirklich Grundsatzdebatten weiterführen muss, die eigentlich seit 2016 und dann mit der Umsetzung 2018 von der DSGVO erledigt sein sollten. Letzter Punkt dazu. Ich glaube, dass das relativ viel sagt und das ist ja vorher auch schon gut angesprochen worden, über die demokratische und rechtsstaatliche Gesinnung von vielen von diesen Konzernen. Einfach die Idee, wir machen, was wir wollen, wir haben gesetzlich irgendwelche Regeln, aber wir finden einen Weg, dass die uns einfach für uns A nicht gelten oder wir uns B einfach jahrelang nicht dran halten und es wird schon nichts passieren. Und das ist teilweise in Europa unterstützt von einigen Mitgliedstaaten, die von Steuerrecht bis Datenschutzrecht einfach eine Nichtdurchsetzung von diesen Dingen de facto machen. Und das ist, glaube ich, auch eine Sache, die wir in Europa uns sehr viel genauer anschauen müssen. Also es kann nicht sein, dass wir auf europäischer Ebene großteils Gesetze verabschieden. Die EU ist am Ende zum großen Teil ein Gesetzgebungsapparat und nicht unbedingt ein Gesetzesumsetzungsapparat. Und wir dann die Durchsetzung in den Mitgliedstaaten einfach nicht auf die Reihe bekommen und uns damit global lächerlich machen zu einem großen Teil. Also da hat man einfach das Problem, dass wir die DSGVO zum Beispiel sehr groß angekündigt haben und inzwischen hört man relativ offen, naja, in Wirklichkeit wird das eh nicht durchgesetzt und in Wirklichkeit muss man sich eh wieder nicht dran halten. Und da hat Europa ein extrem großes Glaubwürdigkeitsproblem. Und ich glaube, dass diese Hoffnung, die teilweise da ist, dass Europa da vorangehen kann, die wird oft am Papier bestätigt. Also wir sind in Europa sicher im demokratischen System dafür, dass das 27 Mitgliedstaaten sind mit sehr verschiedenen Kulturen, durchaus sehr progressiv und durchaus in der Lage, sehr, sehr weitreichende Änderungen zu machen. Aber wir haben ein Riesenthema bei der Durchsetzung am Ende. Also wir haben zum Beispiel jetzt, einer meiner Lieblingskandidaten ist die irische Datenschutzbehörde. Die haben letztes Jahr über 10.000 Beschwerden gehabt, wovon aber keine einzige entschieden worden ist. Das heißt, ich habe in Europa zum Beispiel ein Grundrecht auf Datenschutz, aber von 10.000 Leuten, die dieses Grundrecht geltend machen wollen, hat einfach 0 Leute eine Entscheidung bekommen. Und das ist halt so ähnlich, wie wenn ich sage, ja, ihr habt alle ein Recht auf Wahlen, aber leider ist zu 100% gerade keine Urne da. Und dann habe ich zwar eine Demokratie am Papier, aber nicht in der Realität, und da habe ich eher so einen nordkoreanischen Zugang zur Welt. Und ich glaube, dass wir uns da in Europa teilweise sehr viel ehrlicher sein müssen, auch von diesen Fehlern absolut lernen müssen. Also gerade wenn wir jetzt schauen, wie wir neue gesetzliche Regelungen auf europäischer Ebene schaffen, glaube ich, kann die DSGVO gerade beim Durchsetzungsteil eine gute Warnung sein, wie es nicht funktioniert. Einige Dinge, die praktisch da ein Problem waren, ist, dass man zum Beispiel aus Industriesicht probiert hat, so gewisse Themen, die umstritten waren, einfach nicht zu lösen. Und das heißt dann in der Praxis, dass wir vor irgendwelchen Gerichten stehen und der Richter steht da und sagt, naja, das Gesetz sagt mir eigentlich nichts oder es ist widersprüchlich. Was soll ich jetzt da eigentlich entscheiden? Und genau das war das Ziel natürlich von dem Lobbyismus, dass man sagt, gut, man macht es so schwammig, dass man sich nicht auskennt. Und ein großes Problem davon, gerade bei der DSGVO, ist, dass das nicht nur die Betroffenen betrifft, sondern vor allem auch KMUs, also kleine Unternehmen, die sich nicht leisten können, da jetzt einen riesen Anwaltsapparat loszuschicken, sondern die einfach ein Gesetz wollen, wo klar drinnen steht, Hü oder Hot. Und genau die haben, glaube ich, extreme Schwierigkeiten bei der aktuellen Situation und bei der DSGVO, wie sie dann am Ende passiert ist. Und das führt so weit, dass wir teilweise Behörden haben, die sagen, sie können leider nichts tun, weil gesetzlich ist das alles so unklar und das ist alles so schwierig. Es ist auch für Behörden oft nicht besonders interessant, da einen Schritt weiter zu gehen oder progressiv zu sein. Man probiert sich dann oft hinter irgendwelchen Gründen zu verstecken, dass man nichts tut. Wir haben jetzt zum Beispiel einen Fall in Luxemburg, wo die zuständige Behörde sagt, es tut ja wahnsinnig leid, aber sie kann ja nur innerhalb des Großherzogtums Luxemburg überhaupt irgendwas überprüfen und das Internet ist leider ganz groß und sie haben deswegen faktisch gar keine Möglichkeit, das alles durchzusetzen. Und das sieht man, dass wenn es nicht wirklich ganz explizit ist, wenn es nicht pickelhart ist, wenn es nicht jedes Ding bis auf Punkt und Komma genau definiert ist, wir derzeit, und das kommt leider auch sehr stark aus dem Silicon Valley heraus, eine ganze Industrie haben, die probiert, jegliche Frage irgendwie aufzublasen und so zu tun, als ob das nicht gesetzlich so wäre. Und da komme ich zurück zu diesem Narrativ, der einfach sehr gut funktioniert, der Silicon Valley aufgebaut hat, ist diese Idee, dass ich glaube, bei Facebook war diese Idee, move fast and break things. Und das, was gebrochen wird, ist halt oft das Gesetz. Dass man einfach dadurch, dass man massiv auf allen Ebenen gesetzeswidrig ist, man schon irgendwie durchkommt, weil die Behörden kommen gar nicht hinterher, den wirklich durchzusteigen. Und wenn wir nicht extrem starke Behörden haben, die extrem stark durchsetzen, und ich muss dazu sagen, jedes Mal, wenn ich das sage, tut es mir ein bisschen weh, weil ich eigentlich ein Mensch bin, der an einen liberalen Rechtsstaat glaubt, wo die Behörde möglichst minimalinvasiv vorgeht. Aber ich glaube, wenn wir das nicht haben in Europa, dann werden gerade diese Konzerne mit ihrer Brachialgewalt wirklich schwer sozusagen irgendwie in den Rahmen zu bekommen sein. Und ich glaube, da können wir durchaus einiges lernen, wie wir vielleicht von der DSGVO lernen, was teilweise funktioniert hat, aber teilweise auch nicht funktioniert hat. Und das bei den kommenden Acts irgendwie in eine Bahn leiten, wo das funktioniert und wo wir wahrscheinlich teilweise auch ein bisschen die Hoheit der Mitgliedstaaten beschränken müssen, weil wir einfach diese gewissen Mitgliedstaaten haben, die ein Businessmodell daraus gemacht haben, sich nicht wirklich um Europarecht besonders zu kümmern. Und ich glaube, das müssen wir auch so ein bisschen sozusagen europäisch angehen. Ich hoffe, das hilft mal ein bisschen sozusagen, das dann auf, wie diese Theorien auf der Straße dann funktionieren oder in Gerichtssälen, ein bisschen einen Kontext zu geben, und freue mich extrem auf Fragen und Feedback und Diskussion nachher.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank, Max, für diese Ausführungen. Fragen haben wir schon ganz viele und ich werde dir auch gleich 2 oder 3 stellen, bevor wir dann in den ganz öffentlichen Teil der Debatte gehen, wo wir ganz unterschiedliche Fragen aufgreifen. Danke nochmal auch, dass du betont hast, wie wichtig die Durchsetzung ist, weil das ist ja genau das Problem, das wir haben. Ich glaube, wenn wir die DSGVO von Anfang an konsequent durchgesetzt hätten, hätten wir einige dieser Probleme gar nicht. Und das ist auch Grund, warum mein Team und ich und die halbe Fraktion im Moment auch das Durchsetzungskapitel des DSA neu schreiben mit einem eigenen Vorschlag, um genau diese Durchsetzung da stark zu machen mit starken Behörden, die wirklich diesen Konzernen auf die Stirn bieten können. einige Fragen, die aus dem Publikum genommen sind. Ich möchte mal mit einer anfangen, die sagt, das Prinzip der Einwilligung in die Datenverarbeitung laut DSGVO, was uns ja eigentlich sehr am Herzen liegt, diese Möglichkeit, dass Nutzerinnen und Nutzer selbst entscheiden können, ist doch Teil des Problems statt der Lösung. Müssen wir verhaltensbezogene Datensammlung und Datenanalyse von Big Data nicht generell als rechtswidrig einstufen, um die Möglichkeit zur Selbstbestimmung zurückzuerlangen? Radikale Frage.
Da schlagen zwei Herzen in meiner Brust, muss ich ehrlich sagen. Prinzipiell habe ich eine sehr liberalen Ansicht zu, wie Recht gestaltet sein soll. Und mich kann Recht schlichtweg verwirken. Also ich habe einfach das Recht zu sagen, ich will nicht wählen gehen oder ich will mich von der Brücke stürzen morgen. Also es ist schlichtweg in einem liberalen Rechtsstaat so, dass ich Dinge auch verwirken kann. Ich kann mein Eigentumsrecht aufgeben, indem ich was verschenke. Ne? Also ich glaube, das ist durchaus, da gibt es eine Funktion der Einwilligung. Und ich bin kein Freund, die Leute zu bevormunden und zu sagen, getargetete Werbung ist immer böse. Und wenn jemand das wirklich will, feel free. Ich glaube nur, dass der Modus, wie das passiert, real sein muss. Also es gibt in Wirklichkeit sehr wenig Leute, die sich von der Brücke stürzen wollen und es gibt auch sehr wenig Leute, die wirklich alles überwacht haben wollen, wenn man sie mal ordentlich fragt. Und ich glaube, auf der Ebene muss man das angehen und ein grundsätzliches Problem ist, dass ja die Einwilligung die absolute Ausnahme eigentlich dogmatisch ist. Also im Prinzip habe ich in der DSGVO ja 6 Rechtsgrundlagen und nur eine davon ist die Einwilligung und 5 davon geben mir praktisch Situationen, wo ich Daten ohne großer Diskussion verarbeiten darf. Also bei rechtlichen Pflichten, bei Vertragsverpflichtungen etc. Also bei allem, was jemals auf so einem Tisch gelandet ist, wo jemand normaler sagen wird, ja, da finde ich es okay, dass meine Daten verarbeitet werden, bin ich wahrscheinlich zu 95% schon vom Gesetz gedeckt und brauche gar keine Einwilligung. Diese Einwilligung sollte eigentlich die Ausnahme sein. Und das ist historisch anders gewachsen. Das kommt einerseits aus dem California Business Act. In Kalifornien gibt es eben diese Notice-and-Choice-Prinzip, auf dem der Großteil vom Silicon Valley längste Zeit gearbeitet hat. Und die haben einfach dieses Notice-and-Choice in unsere Einwilligung verpackt. Und was ein Notice-and-Choice zum großen Teil und auch die Einwilligung jetzt, wie sie verwendet wird, ist ein reines Responsibility-Shifting. Also die Verantwortung vom Unternehmen zum Nutzer abzuschieben und zu sagen, nicht wir, du bist schuld, dass du gewilligt hast, und gleichzeitig aber keine andere Möglichkeit geben. Und dieses Responsibility Shifting ist etwas, was eigentlich bei einer ordentlich durchgesetzten Einwilligung in Europa, also bei ordentlichem Anwendung der DSGVO nicht möglich sein sollte. Wir haben uns jetzt zum Beispiel diese Cookie-Banner eben angeschaut, über 10.000 Seiten, und da sehen wir, dass wir nicht mal 10% der Seiten haben, die das nicht mit irgendwelchen manipulativen Dingen probieren zu erlangen. Und das sind Dinge, wo wirklich die Behörden bei uns glaube ich, verpflichtend sind. Ich glaube nicht, dass wir in allen Bereichen eine Einwilligung ausschließen sollen. Es gibt die Möglichkeit vom Gesetzgeber, dass wir sagen, gut, bei gewissen Dingen ist eine Einwilligung vollkommen ausgeschlossen. Also ich kann schlichtweg zum Beispiel, was weiß ich, meine Leber nicht verkaufen, aber ich kann einwilligen, dass meine Nieren gespendet werden. Also selbst da sind wir eigentlich sehr liberal und natürlich stellt sich dann die Frage, warum wäre es im Datenschutz nicht so, ne?
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank. Und nochmal die Erinnerung daran, dass wir ja gerade so einen Feldversuch haben mit dem neuen Betriebssystem von Apple, wo man Opt-in machen muss. Also man muss sich aktiv dafür entscheiden, sich von Facebook tracken zu lassen, wenn man wenn man die App installiert. Und 96% der amerikanischen User lehnen das eindeutig ab. Von daher stimmt das, wenn man den Menschen eine wirkliche Wahl lässt, dann entscheiden sie sich auch richtig. Aber das passiert eben nicht. Nochmal eine etwas technische Frage, aber du kannst dich gerne natürlich auch über diesen technischen Rahmen hinaus bewegen in der Antwort. Die Frage ist zu Browsern, also wäre es möglich, Browserhersteller zu verpflichten, eine Funktion zu implementieren, mit der die Datensammelei von Webseiten mit einem Klick in den Browser-Einstellungen dauerhaft so eingeschränkt wird, dass nur für den Betrieb eines Webdienstes notwendige Daten gesammelt werden und keine DSGVO-Banner mehr angezeigt werden. Hat man ja eigentlich schon mit Do Not Track und so weiter, ne? Aber klappt alles noch nicht so richtig. Ist das eine Option?
Genau, also ich glaube, es ist auch ein bestes Beispiel, wie EU-Gesetzgebung nicht funktioniert hat. Es gibt ja dieses Opt-out eigentlich in der DSGVO, es ist nur de facto nicht umgesetzt worden und wir haben auch in Debatten mit Unternehmen haben die gesagt, naja, es hat uns ja niemand gesagt, welcher Standard jetzt der richtige ist und da gibt es ja überhaupt keine Möglichkeit, das jemals festzulegen etc. Die ganze Debatte ist perfekt in der E-Privacy-Verordnung. Dort sollte es ja eigentlich geregelt werden. Und wir haben auch vor 2 Wochen, ich weiß nicht, ob sich die Frage darauf bezieht, einen Modell-Prototyp-Standard mal veröffentlicht als NOYB, gemeinsam mit der Wirtschaftsuni in Wien. Das heißt ADPC, also Advanced Data Protection Control. Und ja, die Idee ist, dass es sozusagen eine spezifische Einwilligung ist. Bisher das Do Not Track ist ja nur ein Opt-out. was ja der europäischen Dogmatik nicht entspricht, weil wir brauchen ja ein Opt-in. Und dieses Opt-in gibt es derzeit kein Signal, wie man das sozusagen übermitteln kann. Es ist technisch wirklich banal. Die Industrie sagt natürlich, das ist ganz schwierig, das kann man leider nicht tun. Jetzt haben wir uns als NGO mal bemüßigt gefühlt, innerhalb von 2-3 Monaten das mal auch sozusagen zu veröffentlichen und hinzustellen, um zu zeigen, es ist machbar. Die große spannende Frage ist, wird das im Trilog umgesetzt? Also ich glaube, dass in der E-Privacy das der richtige Platz wäre für dieses spezifische Problem. Und auch eine Möglichkeit geben könnte, dass ich praktisch meinen Consent Management selber mache in meinem Browser und da gibt es durchaus die Möglichkeit, wie gesagt, ADPC erklärt das, wie sowas funktionieren könnte. Wir glauben nicht, dass der Standard der ultimative Wahrheit ist, aber es ist vielleicht schon 90% der Wahrheit und einfach nur um zu zeigen, dass das machbar ist. Und die große Frage ist, der Gesetzgeber muss es festlegen und muss sagen, es gibt einen Mechanismus, wie man dann sagt, dieser Standard ist der, den jede Webseite in Europa einbauen muss. Solange wir diesen Mechanismus im Gesetz nicht haben, wird jede Webseite sagen, wer weiß schon, was der richtige Standard ist. Ne?
Ja, da sehen wir mal wieder die Durchsetzung und das Konkrete. Ich habe noch eine persönliche Frage, die kam aber auch in den Fragen durchaus vor. Warum gibt es oft so viel Misstrauen, wenn es darum geht zu sagen, naja, wir implementieren eine öffentliche Lösung, öffentliche Plattformen zum Beispiel, öffentliche digitale Identitäten und so weiter. Da gibt es oft sehr viel Skepsis, auch gerade so aus der Community, aus der Datenschutz-Community. Während ja entweder gegenüber privaten Unternehmen diesen weniger Skepsis entgegengebracht wird, oder man findet halt Wege, um für sich persönlich da einen Ausweg zu finden, aber lässt dann natürlich komplett beiseite, dass die Gesellschaft trotzdem davon erfasst wird und dass man dem auch nicht dauerhaft aus dem Weg gehen kann. Ne? Also Shoshana Zuboff sagte ja gerade schon, es gibt eigentlich gar nichts anderes mehr. Man ist im Prinzip darauf angewiesen. Es gab auch eine Frage von einem Menschen, der eine Gehörloseninitiative oder Organisation vertritt und sagt, naja, wir haben eigentlich gar keine andere Möglichkeit, als Untertitel von Google-Systemen zu verwenden. Wie kann man dieses Recht auf Barrierefreiheit vereinen mit dem Recht auf Datenschutz? Also warum diese Skepsis gegenüber öffentlichen Initiativen und wie kann man damit umgehen und wie kann man gleichzeitig auch, und damit, sorry, ein bisschen komplex, noch greife ich noch eine dritte Frage auf, was kann man machen, dass eben europäische Open-Source-Lösungen, die nicht tracken, die keine Überwachung machen, auch in diesem wirtschaftlichen Umfeld überhaupt eine Chance haben?
Ich glaube, es sind im Kern 2 Fragen. Das eine ist die Frage öffentlich und öffentlich hat immer Zwang. Also wir haben das zum Beispiel bei diesen Corona-Tracking-Apps gesehen, also in Österreich war das eine Riesenaufregung, allein weil das Ding Tracking-App geheißen hat, selbst wenn das, glaube ich, die datenschutzfreundlichste App war, die jemals aus unserem Tisch gelandet ist. Aber die Idee, dass da irgendein Zwang ist und öffentlich und Staat hat doch irgendwie dann einen Ausschlag. Obwohl jedes Android-Betriebssystem und wahrscheinlich auch jedes jedes Apple-Betriebssystem mit mehr Tracking-Apps geliefert wird, als diese App jemals wäre. Aber das ist die Schwierigkeit, dass Leute, glaube ich, das oft technisch nicht verstehen. Und vieles von dieser Diskussion in Wirklichkeit eine Bauchgefühlsdiskussion ist. Also wer könnte, von wem habe ich Angst, etc. Und wir haben teilweise Vereinsaustritte gehabt, weil wir gesagt haben, die App ist gar nicht so schlimm. Dann haben sie gesagt, wenn ihr nicht gegen die App seid, dann dann kündige ich meine Mitgliedschaft, zum Glück nur ganz wenige. Aber da ist durchaus ein Fehler oder durchaus ein Problem. Ich glaube nicht, dass der Staat immer die beste Lösung ist für diese Sachen. Der Staat ist normalerweise durchaus träge, hat auch seine Interessen und ich glaube, dass eben das Zweite in der Frage, die Open-Source-Thematik in Wirklichkeit die sinnvollere ist. Und ich glaube, dass Europa da wieder dogmatisch einen sehr guten Zugang hat. Und der hat in den USA auch bestanden. Also der Großteil von dem, was wir in Europa als Antitrust-Law haben, kommt ja aus den USA. Ich glaube nur, dass er bei uns noch aktuell lebendiger ist. Und wenn wir uns zum Beispiel anschauen, dass wir in Europa offene Telefonnetze haben, offene Stromnetze haben, offene Zugnetze haben, dass ich heute mir aus meiner Telefonsteckdose 50 verschiedene Internetanbieter rausziehen kann. Das verstehen meine amerikanischen Freunde meistens nicht, weil da gibt es einen Anbieter, der kostet $100 und that's it. Und der heißt dann AT&T und alle hassen ihn. Und wir haben in Europa eigentlich diese offene Netzidee und die kommt sehr stark aus der EU heraus. Die ist ja nicht was die nationalen Mitgliedstaaten wollten, sondern wir haben ja den nationalen Mitgliedstaaten aufgedrungen, ihre normalerweise nationalen Monopole aufzusplitten. Und diese Idee von Monopolaufsplittung ist extrem inhärent im europäischen Recht. und ist, glaube ich, jetzt extrem interessant für die Digitalisierung, weil was ist passiert? Wir haben eigentlich ein vollkommen offenes Netz gehabt, eine offene Idee von Internet. Ich kann von jeder Mailbox zu jedem anderen Mail-Server schicken. Das ist niemand braucht bei einem zentralen Mail-Service zu sein. Aber auf das hat sich jetzt obendrauf diese Monopolsystematik draufgesetzt, ne, die halt probiert, das immer weiter in ihre Walled Gardens zu kriegen. Und ich glaube, es wäre strategisch das Wichtigste zu sagen, dass wir in gewissen Bereichen eine gesetzliche Verpflichtung haben zu zumindest mal offenen Schnittstellen. Ich muss noch nicht alle Daten offen sein, aber es muss praktisch überall eine offene Schnittstelle möglich sein. Und damit könnten wir den Markt wieder in Gang bringen, der oft zum Liegen gebracht ist. Weil wenn ich jetzt zum Beispiel schaue, Facebook als soziales Netzwerk ist sowas von nicht innovativ. Diese Seite ist seit 10 Jahren genau der gleiche Scheiß. Ja? Und da ist überhaupt keine Innovation. Aber wenn man jetzt sagt, zum Beispiel, es gibt ein Netzwerk, was jetzt für Gehörlose interessant ist oder für Leute, die jetzt, sagen wir mal, blind sind, die einfach nicht Bilder brauchen, sondern vielleicht Texte oder eine Bildbeschreibung etc. Sowas kann ich machen, wenn ich ein offenes Interface habe und wenn ich die Möglichkeit habe, solche anderen Initiativen zuzulassen. Und ich glaube, da wäre Europa auch in einer sehr galanten Position, weil es nicht sozusagen, wir bringen die amerikanischen Unternehmen um, was ja immer so das Narrativ ist der US-Industrie, dass das ja alles ganz böse ist, sondern zu sagen, ja, wenn ihr so innovativ und spritzig und toll seid, wie ihr glaubt, dann werdet ihr auch bei einem offenen Netzwerk immer die Gewinner sein. Und ich glaube, dass man auch von der Verkaufsstrategie da eine Möglichkeit gibt und aber auch eben gerade kleineren Unternehmen oder Nischenprodukten eine Möglichkeit gibt, an diesen Produkten wieder teilzunehmen. Ich glaube, seitdem ich mich mit Facebook beschäftige, habe ich ca. 500 E-Mails bekommen zum neuen, offenen, besseren sozialen Netzwerk und alle von denen sterben einfach am Netzwerkeffekt und weil einfach alle anderen auf dieser Plattform sind. Und wenn wir das irgendwo, glaube ich, gut hinkriegen könnten, dann wäre es in Europa, weil wir einfach das in allen anderen Bereichen gemacht haben. Und dann stellt sich die Frage, warum nicht im Internet und nicht bei der Digitalisierung, wenn es für Stromlieferung geht und für Gaslieferung und für sonst irgendwas. Ne?
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank. Also Datenschutz und Wettbewerbspolitik sind überraschend komplementär und brauchen sich, glaube ich, gegenseitig. Das ist ja auch der Sinn der heutigen Debatte, dass wir über Grundrechte sprechen, über Datenschutz, aber eben auch über Wirtschaftspolitik und Digitalpolitik. Und damit übergebe ich zur Moderation der allgemeinen Debatte wieder an meinen Co-Host Sven Giegold.
Thank you, Alex. Now let's continue our show of heroes. And the next one is, of course, Jan-Philipp Albrecht. Jan-Philipp, perhaps you can switch on your camera. And I also welcome Andreas Schwab, who is now with us, who is still having the chance to become a hero. So also, and therefore, that is really a cool meeting here. So Jan, could you tell us, how do you see things? So you are now Minister for Digital and Draußen, as you say, you can explain that later, for the great state of Schleswig-Holstein, which is a superpower in the north of Germany. And beyond, but what do you make of it? So we had all celebrated the GDPR rules. You received great applause by Shoshana. And what do you make of it? Were your hopes realized, and where yes and where no? I know it's a hard question, it's a big one, but perhaps you can keep mainly in mind what you will tell us, what you will tell Andreas and us, what to put now in the next stage of European rules in the area.
Thank you for inviting me. And the first big question is if I should talk in English or German. Okay, I decide. So English. I'm happy to reflect a bit on what has been said. Maybe not by repeating things, but by saying some different views. I'm not completely sure if the lack of enforcement can be fixed inside the legal framework which we are having. We tried to fix that during the process of passing the General Data Protection Regulation in a way which built up a legal framework for cooperation of data protection authorities. And I think that this is one of the major keys to succeed in a supranational framework and in an international market. We need to have a strong legal framework for cooperation of enforcement agencies, which makes sure that if one is not doing his or her job properly, another one can force him to do so. The framework is in place. It's part of the general data protection regulation. You can force a data protection authority in one of the member states to do what the majority of data protection authorities in Europe wants. The problem with it is, first, therefore, you need to have data protection authorities which are well equipped to have people to work out the basis for such a legal decision, and to have insight into cases which are mainly dealt with by another authority, and they are into the case normally. And secondly, you need to have the willingness of not only the authorities, but also their employers, the governments or parliaments, to sue other member states' authorities, which is very uncommon inside the European Union. It's even very uncommon that member states are suing each other on infringing the treaties which they signed for the European Union. We see that at the moment when it comes to rule of law in Poland or in Hungary. Where it is a surprise in the end that after years of debate, the European Commission is starting infringement procedures. Normally, only the European Commission is doing that at all. And in this case, the Data Protection Authority of the European Union doesn't really have to say anything in the cooperation mechanism, and doesn't really have the power to go on the issues which are not directly linked with the EU institutions themselves. So that is the main problem and can only be solved in the member states of the European Union and in the data protection authorities of all the member states. So what I would like to add is that in the end, I don't think that fixing the legal framework is in the end fixing the problem, because this legal framework has been built up over decades. We have had directives in the European Union which were strong already. We had national laws which were strong. And we have that also in many other areas. We have fundamental rights, not only in the member states, but also in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is now by the ECJ declared directly applicable in many cases. So it's all in place. The legal framework. We can make it more specific. We can make it therefore better for Max and others to go in front of courts to ask for things to be enforced. But what we can't fix with it is the incapability of agencies and enforcement authorities to do their work. And I say that as a responsible minister for a German land, which of course has to deliver for that. And that's not so easy, because you have to have the awareness in governments that data protection and other digital rights are not nice to have, and that surveillance of market players in this regard are not a nice to have, but an important cornerstone of our digitized future and of a functioning market, and of a fundamental right framework which is looking into a completely digitized and therefore globalized world. And I hope that we can build up that awareness, and I hope that we can also build up strong agencies. Maybe in some areas, like with the digital markets or digital Service Act, it makes sense to go on with debates of, for example, a strong European agency, so that you can have a more central and competent agency doing work directly rather than going through the member states. But I also have to say, if you concentrate only on that, you might lose everything in the end, because member states still have a lot of power in the European Union. Thanks.
Thank you. And now I would also, in order to bring everybody in, because Andreas Schwab is now the man to talk to. Andreas, please join us here. If you had already switched on your, yeah, hi Andreas. So this is also Europe. I would like to say that in Germany, in 3 months, we have federal elections. In Berlin, we wouldn't have a seminar like this, that someone who comes from the EPP joins a green seminar and is treated well, and you will be treated well. And we don't make this now an election show. And that is also European Parliament. I would like to say that, and thank you that you were coming. But you could listen to a lot of interesting speakers and views. And what do you make of it? So what is your ambition? You are the rapporteur for the Digital Market Act. So one of the 2 key acts which we are negotiating at the moment, concentrating on exactly these issues like competition, functioning, interoperability, the supervision of the competition. Andreas, what do you make of it?
Well, first of all, a big thanks to you, Sven, and to your colleague that have been organizing that really inspiring meeting. I think what Max and Shoshana have been saying is very, very helpful for our debate and very interesting. And I'm sure that we are all inspired, Alexandra, you and all the others that are here. I would like to make 3 points. The first one being that what Jan Philipp has mentioned, our former colleague, that in the area of data protection, unfortunately, we have to do with a lot of national elements in the law that makes the enforcement of this law a bit more difficult. That's the difference, and I have nothing done for it. It was already like that before. That is different with competition enforcement, and it's important that we really look for enforcement. I have made a change to the Commission proposal, and I hope that we can do that in the end together, because if a law in the European Parliament has to be passed, we need a strong majority in the plenary, and therefore we will need also all of your colleagues, Sven, and all of mine and all of the others. And the point will be that in courts that you can enforce these rules on competition policy also against the gatekeepers in your member state. That can bring help to people like Max that want to go to court and have good arguments to make it happen. But apart from that, still there will be a need to have a centralized enforcement by authorities. And that I want to do the utmost to strengthen it. But let's be honest, there are member states that they don't want to have that. They say the national authorities have to work as well. And I mean, generally speaking, there is nothing to say against national authorities if they work it out all in the exactly same spirit. But unfortunately for data protection, it hasn't worked like that. So enforcement is key. And if we have good ideas, if you have good ideas, I'm very much open to try the utmost to make it happen. Secondly, I would like to say that I have very much liked the open approach of Max and of Shoshana, saying that the logic behind these companies is not that they are purely bad. I think it's a shareholder value. And Sven, you are working a lot in Econ. This shareholder value makes a huge pressure at the moment because there are no fixed costs and no fixed costs. I hope it's the right translation. And therefore, these companies, if they have invested, they just want to push more infrastructure control to make the costs that are there anyhow most efficient. And therefore, we have to act because our market at the moment is not fair. And Max Schrems has mentioned it. These companies are not innovating anymore as they should. So if we do something on this market, we even help businesses and we help consumers that more innovative products are coming back to the market. And finally, Sven, I don't want to do it too long. I'm also interested to listen to other questions. It's obvious that this is not at all anti-American. I think at that point, the Greens, but also the EPP and the Americans are linked to one idea, that it means that if you have a good idea in your life and you want to make out a business of it, and you are talented and you are fighting, that you should have the chance to be able to do it. Chancengleichheit, we call it in German. And with the gatekeepers at the moment, it's not what we have, because if you have the great idea, you're coming to a bottleneck where others decide for you. And if you are not lucky, you are lost. And that cannot be our aim in an economy in the European Union. And I think the Americans don't like that neither. So if we fight together, we can make it. And I hope that we can put strong borders to that monopolies that we have in the digital times. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That was music to our ears. I saw also quite a bit of nodding from Max and Jan and Alex. And one follow-up, which was raised here often, and this is the issue of interoperability. In order to make market and competition really work, binding open interoperability seems to me crucial. So what do you make of that? Now you, Andreas, so how do you see this? How binding should we be, at least when it comes to the larger platforms, so that new competitors get actual access to the marketplace? Andreas.
I mean, I'm very open on this, but I have to tell you that I think we should always know for what aim we want to use interoperability. The DMA, unfortunately, is not the place to make rules for instant messengers. It's something else. It's a competition policy file. So in the competition policy file, there is a role for authorities to make the use of behavioral remedies if there is a need for interoperability. I have very much listened to what Max said on Facebook and Instagram, but so far this alternative interoperable tool for people with problems in listening and seeing or whatever is not yet there. And therefore, what is the AP slot that you have to open? There I'm still open to all proposals, but I do believe that this is not really what the DMA is about. The DMA is about breaking up monopolies and making sure that the market gets fairer by also using, in specific cases, interoperability rules. But interoperability as a principle, I think, is something maybe for another law or in another context, except behavioral remedies that are needed. But I'm still listening to this and looking forward for ideas that improve it. We have already had, and Alexandra was there, one exchange in the committee. There was a call for that. But still, the key question is, where do we use it for what interoperable service that there is? Because it should not be at the end that the gatekeepers make the rules on interoperability, but those who want to use it.
Yeah, Minister Jan wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that there had been several tries to get interoperability done, especially in the field of text messaging or any other communication service, especially when it comes to the communications and telecommunications code of the European Union. Throughout the last 3-4 years, there had been several attempts, and it had all been voted down, by the way, also in the European Parliament. And the next chance would be maybe by like adding some changes to those regulations when passing the e-privacy regulation. I have the feeling that the pressure isn't high enough to get this done at the moment. The pressure was very, very high back then when telecommunications started on mobile communication at all to get that done. And it was a great liberty which was starting afterwards by having interoperable systems, so you can at least text and call each other's on mobiles, that you can change your contract easily. And I think that obviously the public debate is not ready yet to take that also with communication services on the internet, which is a bit bizarre, but it shows how less understanding about digitization and the consequences of too less regulation in this process is in the public opinion. And I would very much hope that this debate will be taken on board a lot, also during the debates on the DMA and other issues.
Max wanted to come in, and of course, always Shoshana has the right to come in with whatever she wants to put into the debate. So Max, please.
Just one short, I'll try to be super short on what Andreas has said. I think it's totally accurate that we basically have a bit of a wild, wild west unless we have like serious enforcement. It's going to continue like that because that's the whole strategy. And I was taught in the US in my law school, make a risk assessment of how likely it is that there's going to be enforcement and then make a decision to go ahead anyways. So that's simply how a lot of these decisions are made. And unless there's serious enforcement, we don't have that. Second thing, I think on this whole market thing, it's rather interesting because in the broader picture, we should be rather unanimous on that in the European Union, from the very left to the very right, because competition is usually something everybody agrees on to a certain extent. The one other addition that I would have on this idea of innovation, I think there's a fundamental difference in how I was taught competition in Europe. and how I witness it in the Silicon Valley. In the Silicon Valley, we basically have a runoff phase. We have 2 or 3 competing companies where one of them just gets the biggest amount of money, dumps everybody else off the market, and then that market is theirs, full stop. So we don't have a continuous competition as we are used to it by 50 people on the market that drives that innovation, that basically has this whole market systems run for them. We have a monopoly building competition at the beginning. So you have Lyft versus Uber, and at some point, one of them becomes so dominant that everybody else goes off the market. I think that fundamental difference in how competition is seen is something that would have to differentiate between a European model and a Silicon Valley model. I'm explicitly saying Silicon Valley because the US model is different sometimes than the rest, than the Silicon Valley specifically. Last thing on the interoperability, that, for example, on messengers has been around in the end of the 90s. There were ICQ Messenger, MSN Messenger, all these different messengers that you had on your computer at the time for the older generation that I'm now counting myself to. And there were interoperable protocols like Java, for example, to enable you to write to another messaging service. It's absurd that we don't have that capacity anymore 20 years later. Like I was able to send a message from, I don't know, WhatsApp to Signal. And now 20 years later, that's for some random reason not possible. And I think that's going to be very hard to explain to the European public. If I can choose my electricity provider, my gas provider, if I can take my phone number from one provider to the next, all of these things are possible. But from one messaging service to the other, that's apparently not possible. I think that's going to be a very hard sell. And therefore, I think interoperability would be super interesting. Last word, I have no clue about the Digital Markets Act. I haven't read it in detail at all so far, I have to admit. But what would be super interesting is that we at least have a capacity that in delegated implementing acts, some player can say, if it's the commission or whatever else, is that for this market area, you need that interoperability with that standard. So if we have that power, that could allow us to gradually say, okay, we see messaging services as a problem. There would be that protocol. Every messaging service in Europe has to use that protocol, full stop. And there we could gradually give that power wherever there's a bigger issue to go ahead. I can see that, there may be minor, apps where we may not need that from the beginning, but for major things, there could be that power.
I'll make a comment.
Oh yeah, Shoshana, please.
So, as you might expect, this is sort of a meta comment. Because so I'm listening at that level, but there's a theme that I've been hearing, and the theme is many of us agree, or I believe, or many of us believe that our objective should be X, but then when we go to accomplish X through our current institutions, very difficult. And there are lots of reasons why it's very difficult. And Max was extremely eloquent, and and we've heard others from Philip and so forth. But so here's this this friction, this misalignment. And what I want to propose is the following: that this is exactly what we should expect right now. Because, for example, and forgive me for, I have the American timeline more firmly in my brain than I do the German timeline. So forgive me on that. But if I can use the American case for a moment, we were well into the 20th century trying to solve real problems of, the lack of a living wage, grossly dangerous working conditions, child labor, and so forth. And so as you study the history, there's this period where there are more and more people gathering around a new set of objectives. But the institutions at that point, being inherited from the 19th century, simply could not accommodate these goals. In America, it took until the 4th decade, with the exception of a few key institutions like the federal, like the Food and Drug Administration, which came on stream, I want to say 1913, after about 26 years of crusading. And what flipped it was Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, of course. But the point is that and even the Food and Drug Administration that was first formulated in 1913, the far cry from the Food and Drug Administration that was reformulated in the fourth decade under Roosevelt, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So, and everything, I mean, workers' rights, consumers' rights, all the institutions that we needed to oversee safe banking industry, safe equities industry, the Federal Reserve, OSHA, the occupational health and safety, all of the social safety nets, all of these institutions came out of this paroxysm of creativity that I shudder to think in America, really waited until the fourth decade. We can't wait until the fourth decade. We cannot. So what I'm hearing is the same kind of the mismatch between what we must accomplish to create a democratic information civilization and the institutional capabilities that we have currently in the bank, that we've currently developed. We need to focus attention on this as a meta problem, because if the DSA or the DMA or GDPR or the new legislative proposals for artificial intelligence, which I should have mentioned earlier because they are incredibly important in this mix. If we are going to achieve these goals, we have to figure out with our creativity, purpose-built institutional processes that will drive this. And this includes the relationships among member states, the relationships between the center and the member states. All of this needs to be reimagined at a very deep level with actors like all of you who are so deeply committed, convening the right people, in the room over time to undertake this kind of invention.
Thank you. And perhaps if Jan and Andreas are still with us, I would like to share 2 points from the audience, and one from Baden-Württemberg for Andreas, and by a well-known person, Niels Nauhauser. I will read it in German because he has spelled it out in German. He works for the Consumer Protection Organization in Baden-Württemberg. Das Prinzip der Einwilligung in die Datenverarbeitung laut DSGVO ist doch Teil des Problems statt der Lösung. Müssen wir verhaltensbezogene Datensammlung und Datenanalyse in Klammern Big Data nicht generell als rechtswidrig einstufen, um die Möglichkeit zur Selbstbestimmung zurückzuerlangen? So, Max has already explained his view on this, but I would like to open this a bit further. And the second question is by a German, but in English, so I will read it in English. It's by Matthias Hönisch, representing the German Banking Federation of Federations, and he comes from the German cooperative banks. And it's very interesting what he's writing. In Europe, we are extremely dependent on international card schemes like MasterCard, Visa, and the like, and even more dependent from GAFA. Since payment is equivalent to information management, this is of utmost importance for data sovereignty of European customers. For those very good reasons, the cooperative banks in Germany welcome the DMA, since this act might help to bring back power to the Europeans. We truly believe that a standardized interface to GAFA infrastructures might help to bring back data to consumers and allowing European financial institutions and consumers to restore their digitalized bank cards within smartphones without paying GAFA a fortune. So anyone who wants to come in on these issues?
Well,
Andreas.
well, Sven, maybe I start. I think that the point from the Banking Association is right one. The GAFAs are not even sticking to PSD2 rules that are dealt with in your committee, Sven, because they say they are not a banking service. They are just a transaction tool for the data to be delivered, but for sure you pay with them, and therefore we have to adapt PSD2. I think that is something that we will do together soon. On the other point, with the question of data, I think Shoshana and also Max have already mentioned the element there. The key question is, who owns the data? I mean, all the questions that we have been putting into Google, is it really Google who owns these questions now, or is it us that we have been asking these questions, that we are still the owner? Now, it's true that we have given consent, and the citizen from Baden-Württemberg, who has kindly reminded us that this is a big problem, has rightly made the point that we have to check that. But still, I think our debate tonight is more philosophical, more general than the laws that are on the table. And I think it was very kind from Shoshana to say that she trusts us, and we have to trust a bit the Commission, that we get an overarching proposal list where we can cover all the different elements. Because the issues with the DSA, where Alexandra is working on, is very much also linked with questions around the Trump upheaval at his day of giving up his office. In the DMA, we speak rather really about purely competition policy to reverse it and to change the burden of proof to the gatekeepers that have very often not done something which is allowed, but it was not as clearly forbidden as needed. And that's what we want to change. And the question of IP and intellectual property, how to deal with that data that are there, that we need for that new system of economy, but that have to be distributed more fairly. That is, I think, a question, maybe not for another evening, but at least for another law.
Then if I may add one thing, I am absolutely not a friend of forbidding certain processing activities and trying to nanny people away from giving their data. I really think that it would be the wrong path, because in a liberal society, which I would like to live in, self-determination is one of the main bases on which we build our common sense. And the question is not to not allow me, as Max said, to like hurt myself or sell myself, but the question is to make me fully aware of all the consequences and to give me insight into what's happening. And therefore, I would like to emphasize that there is one thing which the GDPR, alongside with other rules, is giving us, and that is that everybody should have the right to get the logic behind automated processing, to understand what processing is doing, and to assess whether not only the process, but also the purpose of that processing, therefore, with all its transparency, is a good thing or a bad thing. And in the end, to either tax, regulate, or even forbid certain purposes and certain business models, rather than trying to forbid certain technical patterns, because you can use the processing of personal data and even AI techniques, which might be used in a very bad way, also in a very good way. And I therefore would really warn from getting away of the a concept of consent, because it's the basis of our self-determination. And I would even say that you can't get away from it without changing the European treaties.
Yes, so we are finally going to conclusion. There's one question by Jana Reimer, I think, or similar, yeah. And that is to Shoshana. And that is, today citizens feel benefits by Facebook, Google, and Amazon, and only go to court in individual cases. How do we raise awareness among citizens that they should be just as active as those forming unions during industrialization? So basically, how do we get citizens to all join a Max organization and others? So small hint to the audience. But Shoshana, on a more general term, how do you see that?
Well, there's no question that public opinion, public education, public opinion, and ultimately collective action coming from the public in a whole variety of new forms is essential to this the democratic counter-revolution, as I put it today. And in fact, that was a question that I wanted to to mention in relation to Max's concerns. Just, what is the role right now that the public is playing or can play or should play? Now, when it comes to the specific question asked by our participant, we're operating in this milieu right now, which has had the benefit of 2 decades of intense propaganda work. Think of it as gaslighting, intense gaslighting of the public that has been engineered and scripted, practiced through trial and error, perfected on the part of the tech giants. And so there is a lot of confusion and a lot of disorientation. People over the past few years, haven't been certain. One issue is exactly what Philip was asking, which is it's not whether or not I choose to share data, it's whether or not I have any clue of what's happening to those data were I to share. Do you have any clue that your family photos on Facebook have been scraped into Microsoft's celebrity facial recognition software, the best facial recognition software in the wild, and ultimately was sold to military divisions of the Chinese army that imprison the Uyghurs in open air spaces where they are continuously monitored by facial recognition, in part built by our family photos, right? That is one of thousands of examples where we have been told that we're making a private calculation to give a little bit of data for a good trade-off. We get these free services, when in fact, go back to something I said earlier, those trillions of data points being ingested every day by Facebook's AI, only a fraction of them are what we knowingly gave Facebook. The rest is what has been captured through, dare I say it, surveillance. So, so we have a public that has been disadvantaged intentionally, that has been engineered into ignorance intentionally, and therefore we have a lot of work in public education. Now, having said this, there is, in my view, an unquestionable sea change in the public mind. Let me start with America. By August of 2020, well into the pandemic, remember, we went into the pandemic with the tech companies saying, this will be the end of techlash. Everyone's going to depend on us, Zoom, everybody's going to love us because we're enabling their lives, their children's education, and so on and so forth. Well, early on, reporters were calling me about that. I said, just the opposite is going to happen. We're all going to feel angry. We're all going to feel the indignity of this dependency and its operations. Well, of course, by the end of August, two very substantial national surveys in America, which has been the laggard in this subject, showed unbelievable majorities in the 70th, 80th, and 90th percentiles across the board, a complete rupture of faith with these companies. They're creating more problems than they're solving. They're putting their profits above a society and democracy. We don't trust them. The only entity that garners less trust than Mark Zuckerberg is the tobacco industry, and on and on and on. So that's an indication of real change. And what's really, you know, what's really kind of blocking this is that you feel indignant, you feel angry, you fill out the survey this way. What do you do? Where do you go? There's no 911 to call. There's no information line to call at Google or Facebook or any of the others. So what do you do? So this again is part of this institutional discussion. We need to build the channels that move from all the people I know in my little community here are really fed up with all of this. They want to know what to do. So between the democratic institutions and the lawmakers need these citizens. They need these fed up citizens. They need these indignant citizens. How do we build the channels that connect the lawmakers and the citizens? Because lawmakers are going to go further, faster. The things that we've been talking about are not pipe dreams if the citizens are at the back of the lawmakers, imposing pressure at every move. And the citizens move from being merely indignant to actually being constructive. And that is what happened in the 20th century in my country. That was so much a part of the push toward institution building. So this is something that I think that needs attention in your larger program of finalizing this first foundational era of new legislation, and not as something that will just be emergent and will be opportunistic, but as something that we intentionally build into our societies, which is why I brought up the the right of private action, because as Max has done, he has used that right of private action to create an institution, none of your business, and that institution gathers plaintiffs to it. It gathers indignant citizens to it, and it becomes a hub of creative action. So critical subject, and there's a lot that is happening and a lot we can do.
Thank you so
Alexandra,
much.
over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shoshana Zuboff. This was very impressive, very difficult to add important words to after listening to you. This is really a challenge. I think what is really important is to understand that this is not about digital technology. This is about the civilization, the society which we want to live in. And this is why this topic regards everybody and not only people interested in the technology. It regards even more maybe those who are not interested in the technology, but interested in living in a free and democratic society. And I think the good news we can take away from tonight is that you said it in the beginning, Europe is the frontier. And the world is looking at Europe for leadership. And I think this is very impressive because in Europe, especially those who work on technology always have the feeling or always told we are being left behind the US and behind China, and we have to catch up. And then look, maybe we don't have to catch up because we're going in a different direction and we will be the leaders in that direction. So I think this is a really encouraging narrative. And I also very much like the idea of being a young information civilization, so we can still decide who we want to be. And it's very important what Max Schrems said also in the beginning. Let's break up the narrative of inevitability. This is really what in the Brussels bubble, everybody is telling you, the companies are telling you, and even my colleagues, well, I mean, what do you want to do about it? It's like that anyway. And any suggestion to live in a really free and democratic society, to have real data protection, real privacy is considered radical. But it's not. It's our constitution. Those are our European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Those are our values. And the same way we defend them when we speak about rule of law, or maybe in some other European member states, we should have rule of law in all 27 member states as far as democracy and data protection are concerned. So the Titanic is moving towards the iceberg, but I'm sure that in Europe, we have the force to divert it, to avoid the iceberg and to go into open sea, into a better kind of sea. And what is really important and what we're actually working on day and night in these days is the enforcement structure. We need a legislation that we can really enforce. And here, I hope we will get a strong consensus, at least in the European Parliament and in the European Council, to come up with that. Another focus of my work is, and I was happy that you mentioned that, Professor Zuboff, the harms affect real normal citizens, and they have no way, they have no redress. And this is something we can set right within the DSA with good notice and action, with real redress. But we're also building in elements of really democratic civic participation with citizens' assemblies and social media council and so on, because I think we have this equation of governments and authorities on the one hand and big corporations on the other one, and where are the citizens? And I think the citizens really should have their say here, and we have the chance in the DSA to do that. I think a very open question where I saw a little bit of disagreement between you, Shoshana, on the one hand, and Max and Jan-Philipp on the other hand, and I think this is a really important issue, is how can we use consent as an instrument in a world where people don't have an understanding of what really happens with their data? So I would like to stick to the idea of consent, but I think right now people don't know and don't really have the possibility to know what they're consenting to exactly. So how to solve that equation, that's not clear to me yet. I think we need a lot more information. And I'm very happy we have a great speaker like you informing us about what is really happening with our data, what is the hidden layer behind it. And how can we use consent in that kind of situation? How can we shape the instruments in order for people to understand? I read last week in an official document of the UK government that Google holds the equivalent in terms of data of 3 million pages of a Word document about every single user. 3 million pages of a Word document. You know, if you write that in a cookie banner, I'm not sure how many people will still agree. And also the example you made on the Uyghurs and our facial recognition, our family pictures used for persecuting a population. But how do you put that on a consent form? This is still a little bit of a dilemma I'm battling with, and I hope for help in the future. But what is important is this is not inevitable. We can change this. We can create a better society. And I think, and we need a lot of things. We need new legislation. We need better enforcement of the existing legislation. That means litigation. We need people's activism in order to push politicians to create public pressure. And in Europe, we need to do it on a European level. This is not a challenge that any member state can face on its own, but it's our common task. It's our common challenge, and I'm sure we will be able to master it on a European level. Obviously, always in a very close dialogue with the US and the transatlantic dialogue. And I'm very happy that there's so many things going on in the US. The US are looking at us, and we are looking at the US, and we're having this really fruitful dialogue at many different levels. And that's important. I think that the Western world stands united here, but if we can manage to be at the forefront here in Europe, personally, as a European, I would be very proud of that. So I count on the help of all of you, because we will need all of you in the big legislation projects we have ahead of us in Europe. And I would like to thank you all for being here tonight. First of all, I would like to thank the interpreters who had a difficult task tonight on this difficult topic. So thank you very much for your work, for making this plurilingual dialogue possible. I would like to thank all the participants for their intelligent and smart questions. I'm sorry, we obviously couldn't take all of them with more than 1,000 people on the call in the beginning and 150 questions. We had to make a choice, and I think it was a choice very well made. I would like to thank Jan-Philipp Albrecht for being with us, Andreas Schwab for being with us, and especially I would like to thank Max Schrems and Professor Shoshana Zuboff for their extremely important and visionary words. I hope you will accompany us further. And I would also like to thank Sven and my team who organized this, which was a lot of work. Thank you so much for your professionality. That was absolutely great. And to all of you who are still with us at this late hour after 2.5 hours, follow us on social media. And I realize this is a perfect contradiction, but we are dealing with monopolies here. And as politicians, in order to be able to communicate to a crowd, we have to go on Zoom, I'm sorry, and we have to communicate on social media. Because if we want to have a critical mass to stop the surveillance and to create a better society with digital technologies, we need this critical mass and we need to reach people. And this is unfortunately where you reach people. I hope we will change this soon. We do our best, but right now you get our news on social media and sign up to our newsletters. We keep you informed on what is going on in Europe. Thank you all very much for this insightful and inspiring evening. And I hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. It's been such a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you.
An honor.
My pleasure and our honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.